And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
The city of New Orleans dates back to the year 1718 when French official Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne was sent from the French government to create a colony in the southern tip of Louisiana. Lemoyne traveled from Quebec all the way across America until he reached the Mississippi River, which connected with the Gulf of Mexico. This situation was crucial to French trade as it connected the heart of America to the Caribbean and subsequently the rest of the world. Lemoyne and his crew settled in the area and named it New Orleans after the French Duke of Orleans. The French and natives were relatively peaceful with one another. Lemoyne was considered a diplomatic man who sought benefit through creating alliances with native tribes. This later led to many natives assimilating into the French culture. Lemoyne established the first housing section in the city named French Quarter. This was situated in a grid-like pattern called the Vieux Carré. The French also introduced Roman Catholicism into Louisiana, which was later reinforced by the Spaniards.
Roman Catholicism was influential in New Orleans culture. An example of that would be the Mardi Gras celebrations. Mardi Gras is a masking festival and has French, Spanish, and African origins. What's special about Mardi Gras in New Orleans is that the masking allowed for communication between sexes, races, and classes that otherwise would have been prohibited. This allowed for different cultures to be exchanged. Another example of Catholic influence in New Orleans is in Voodoo. Voodoo was a black religious cult combining Roman Catholic rituals and traditional African magical rites. In New Orleans, slave owners worked to convert their slaves to Christianity. Their slaves did not give up easily on their beliefs and instead used voodoo as a way to combine their beliefs with Christianity. Voodoo fascinated and repelled the whites of New Orleans who came to watch the public rituals. Voodoo allowed for African Americans to exert their influence on the white ruling establishment. New Orleans was under rule of the Spanish from 1762 to 1803. The French government gave Spain the territory of Louisiana to compensate Spain for the loss of Florida to Britain. During the Spanish rule, a large wave of immigration occurred from all over the Atlantic and held a key component in New Orleans' economy. In 1800, Spain and France signed a secret treaty that stated that Spain must give the Louisiana territory back to France. Louisiana was to stay under Spanish control until the French decided to transfer power. Another large migration wave came from the French Canadians of Acadia, or the Cajuns. After short rule by the French, Napoleon sold the land to America in the Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase deal was made between the United States and the French. The United States bought 828 million square miles of territory from France, thereby doubling the size of the United States. Within this territory was the city of New Orleans. This treaty stated that all inhabitants of the territory would be given U.S. citizenship. New Orleans, which was already a very culturally diverse city, was suddenly at the heart of U.S. trade and commerce. It also stated that ships from France and Spain would still be allowed to enter the port of New Orleans. This allowed for the influence of Spain and France to still be apparent in New Orleans. New Orleans is located at the mouth of the Mississippi, which made it an ideal port for both international and national trade. New Orleans produced and shipped huge amounts of sugar, tobacco, flour, cotton, and whiskey to places such as Europe and America. The city's ideal location for international trade made it become a hub for the exchanging of cultures and ideas from France, Spain, and even Britain. The French and Spanish influence can be seen in the architecture of New Orleans. The French Quarter, one of the oldest areas in New Orleans, shows the initial French influence on the architecture. However, Spanish-type architecture can also be seen in the French Quarter due to their occupation of the city. The slave trade was a large component of the port of New Orleans, as slaves coming from Africa and the Caribbean had strong effects on the culture of the city. New Orleans' interaction with other places such as Africa, Haiti, and Acadia also created a large population of Creole culture.
One of the many things that makes New Orleans one of the most diverse cities in the world is its large Creole population. Creole culture is a very vast and extensive group of people. Creole culture ranges from a mixture of French culture and various other cultures such as Spanish, Cajun, African, and Native American. The term cultural creolization, named after the French Creoles, means the combining of two or more cultures where new and old traditions are practiced. One of the many forms of Creole in the city of New Orleans is the French African Creoles. Beginning in French-occupied Haiti, many African slaves assimilated into the French culture while still practicing their African traditions. In 1791, the Creole slaves of Haiti revolted against the French government, resulting in the freedom of many slaves. Many slaves left the island and settled in French New Orleans, where they can continue to carry out their Creole traditions. The African Creoles lived in peace with the French in the area. Considered almost equal to the whites, many African Creoles were well-educated and literate people. Not soon after, the French government sold Louisiana to America. Americans were astonished to see how the blacks in the city were treated as equals. They were fascinated by the Creoles and their diverse culture. Some of the many African Creole traditions included gumbo, voodoo, and Zydeco music. Zydeco music combined aspects of French, Cajun, African, and Caribbean music and dance. It is also known to be one of the roots of the most known type of music in the city of New Orleans, jazz.
In 1895, New Orleans became the birthplace for jazz. Jazz was influenced by Africans, whites, and Europeans. The musical art was the combination of black music that came over to America through African slaves and the music of white European settlers. Early in New Orleans, jazz was primarily a dance music. An area in New Orleans where they danced to music was in Congo Square. Congo Square used to be an area where hundreds of Africans would come together and play jazz, dance, and socialize. The first jazz musician was Buddy Bolden. Buddy played the cornet and his band became very popular in street parades. The most famous jazz musician from New Orleans is Louis Armstrong. He heavily influenced New Orleans and jazz culture.
Well, I think I affected the culture of New Orleans in a multiple of ways. I started off my career in the 1920s. At the time, I could read music and was proficient at playing the trumpet. I was actually one of the first jazz musicians to play trumpet solos. Trumpet solos allowed for me to show my personality more than playing the trumpet with a group. In 1922, I was invited to play in the Creole Jazz Band in Chicago. We were one of the most influential jazz groups of the time and received support from jazz fans everywhere. In 1926, I began to scat sing, affecting the history of jazz culture. Scat singing is when you use nonsense words and improvise. At the time, I was playing with the Erskine Tate's Little Symphony. I recorded a song called the Heebie-Jeebies, and we became the most famous jazz band in the United States. Other jazz musicians began to use my new type of jazz. In the early 1930s, I returned to New Orleans and had a very warm welcome to the city. They had named a cigar after me, and my music was very popular throughout my home city. My influence heavily impacted New Orleans culture through my music.